Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's show, I'm speaking with journalist and historian Lucy Fulford about her non-fiction book, The Exiled. In The Exiled, Lucy delves into understanding the Asian expulsion from Uganda in 1972, which saw 80,000 South Asian Ugandans being given just 90 days to leave the country by dictator Idi Amin. She goes way back, uncovering how the British Empire led to so many South Asians finding home in Uganda, but also how this impacted the structure of Ugandan society and the impact on Black Ugandans. The book is a mixture of Lucy's own family history, interviews she has undertaken, and copious amounts of research. The book takes us from pre-1972 Uganda to the expulsion itself and beyond, as countless families in the UK and elsewhere strive to build a new life. This is a really thorough and nuanced exploration of that part of history, also sprinkled with Lucy's own musings on race, identity, her sense of belonging and understanding her own heritage. I'm so glad we're in conversation today. Lucy is an experienced multimedia journalist and filmmaker whose work centres on migration, conflict and climate. After graduating from the University of Bristol with a first-class honours degree in history, writing a dissertation on the Rwandan genocide, she studied media law, shorthand and reporting with the NCTJ and worked as a senior reporter and acting editor of a press agency covering breaking news, crime and courts for the National Press in London. She has reported from the front line of the conflict in eastern Ukraine, filmed in the ancient city of Petra, Jordan, and taken the Trans-Siberian Railway across 3 countries. Growing up between cultures has led to an interest in exploring identity, and in her book The Exiled, she explores the generation legacy of forced migration, inspired in part by her family history. Hi Lucy, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Oh, hello. Yeah, I'm great. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you about your book, which has come out very recently, called The Exiled, which is about the Asian expulsion from Uganda in 1972.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really fascinating because your book is a mixture of like your personal family story, but you've also done a ton of research, you've spoken to loads of people, you feature loads of different stories and experiences as well. So what really led to you writing this book? Why did you decide that you wanted to put this particular book together in the form that you've done it as well?
Yeah, so it definitely developed. It's not sort of the final product is definitely not what I always imagined I would write. But the Ugandan Asian expulsion is my family history. So my grandparents had gone from India to Uganda as teachers. My mum was born there. And so I sort of always knew about this family history. I guess as a journalist, I'm interested in stories and I studied history at university. So, all of these points kind of leading me to exploring my personal history. Last year was the 50th anniversary of the expulsion. So I sort of had started thinking in advance of that about doing some kind of project around it. But it wasn't going to be this book project to start with. I was originally thinking about maybe doing a kind of portrait series, Humans in New York style, with individual stories. But as I started digging into it a bit, I sort of felt that might be a bit of a repetitive format, and actually weaving together a richer story with different layers was something I was a bit more interested in. So yeah, kind of started from the personal and then went from there.
So how long did it take you to sort of go from developing this idea to having the finished book?
Yeah, so it's probably been about 4 years, which actually for book publishing isn't even that long. The publication process was pretty swift once we got to it. But yeah, I was sort of developing the ideas. Then we had the pandemic. So some of my original, maybe more travel log approaches involving going to India, making my way to Uganda, did have to change.
Interesting. So you obviously weave kind of like your personal story and your experiences, the story of your grandparents and also your parents, your mother in particular, but also you do some really poignant reflections on your own identity and your own experiences. And actually on the back of the book there's a quote that I just felt so moved by. So it says, perhaps when you come from many places, your past is as much a tapestry of the lands of your forefathers as the people that came before you. A puzzle you can spend your whole life finding the pieces for. And I think so many people will relate to that, people from different walks of life in different parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But I wondered what your personal experiences of that are, and if you could reflect on that absolutely beautiful quote that you've written, which comes also in the introduction of your book as well.
Yeah, that's in the prologue, I think, and it's one of the first things I wrote. And I think it's interesting that that point came up so early in my writing. So obviously that was quite central to my feelings around this subject, but also what would later shape quite a lot of the trajectory of the book itself. Because, yeah, I didn't want to just keep it in 1972. Like, that was quite key to me. I wanted to move it beyond that into how next generation migrants feel about their identity, and that quote kind of typifies that, I suppose. Yeah, so in terms of me personally, I was actually born in Australia and then now live in the UK. The South Asian part, the Ugandan Asian part, means I have India and Uganda in my history as well. So that's sort of 4 places that you can feel a little bit linked to. And I think I grew up in a very multicultural place. It was not something I really thought about a lot as a child. I was kind of interested in it and proud of it, but it wasn't something that othered me in a big way in Australia. Moving to the UK, I then was in very much white majority spaces and did immediately feel very different. And I think from then is probably when I started thinking about my identity more. And also, yeah, just that sort of conflict that comes from not feeling like you maybe belong enough to anything. I didn't grow up in a particularly very Indian culture, but you look different. So, you know, there's all of these different pieces of it. And I think this project in particular, but just also growing up, has allowed me to feel a lot more positivity around that and view it as an exploration that is a lifelong project, really, rather than something that can feel challenging.
So how do you think, so I guess when it comes to the South Asian expulsion from Uganda, there's a part of it which is like very rooted in history and maybe around, I don't know, like social justice or human rights claims and issues. How do you balance that in your own mind when you also think about how closely linked it is to your own personal journey and your own personal growth and understanding who you are and uncovering your own past?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a super complex topic, and that's something I've been trying to bring out in my work, which is that very often when South Asians have looked at this history, it's been from a viewpoint of being the victims, you know, that they were expelled from a country by Idi Amin. They lost everything, you know, homes, jobs, loved ones, pets. And of course, that's a hugely traumatic event. But I think, yeah, like you say, it fits into this broader geopolitical stuff that you have to ask the question, you know, why were people from India in Uganda in the first place? It's colonialism. And why was there an expulsion? It's been very easy for people to rely on the idea that it was a madcap dictator's whim, you know, like a crazy idea that had no justification. But society was uneven. You know, people had Ugandans as servants. Like, there's a lot of things to talk about in terms of anti-blackness and inequality and being a part of a divide and rule system. And yeah, it's not always comfortable to think of that side of things. And I, you know, from a personal perspective, have always been comfortable knowing that my family did behave well and supposedly did have good relations with everybody there, and knowing my grandparents, like, I really know that to be the case. But also you have to know that, like, you were still part of a system which was not positive for a lot of people. So it's a mix of everything in one.
Yeah, and I mean, I wonder what it was like for you to think about the fact that the Ugandan South Asians were expelled, and actually some of their, I don't know, some of their behaviors, some of their choices in terms of business and investment, how that led actually to building resentment. Do you think it changes? Do you think it changes something in the way that we should be looking at and talking about the expulsion?
Yeah, I think you have to place Ugandans at the forefront of how we discuss this. Ugandan's country. And I think South Asians were people who had come there and not necessarily always been very cohesive within society. Then you can also say that wasn't their fault. They were placed there within a colonial system that was hierarchical, and it was white majority on minority on top, South Asians below, and then Ugandans below that. So it's not just to apportion blame to anyone individually, but it is to take responsibility for things that have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's probably what has made the book so rich, is that you take us on this journey that looks at Uganda pre-1972, which is really important to understand how complex and layered the situation was. And, you know, and as you said, it isn't about blaming a specific person or a specific group for anything, because it is all very messy. And I guess the Asians were there, the South Asians were there because of the British Empire, who had their very kind of agendered view of what they needed, which was about as a human resource issue, essentially, right? To fulfill certain jobs and build the railways and all of these things, which they have done around the world, which has led to various things. But I think also, like, although there is this victim sort of narrative that gets told, which obviously I think has its place, and I don't think we want to think about the South Asians as, you know, I don't know, like not being victims of the situation that they were in, because it was an awful situation. But the story that's often told is also one about the good immigrant.
Yeah.
So it's this idea that, you know, the South Asians, that they had moved to Uganda from India, and they worked really hard and they built these businesses, and then they had 90 days to leave and they lost everything, and they came to the UK, and it was difficult, but they built up their businesses again, and a lot of them are doing really well. And I think, you know, you do talk about in the book how that is some people's experiences, but not everybody's. And again, I feel like it feeds into this idea of the good immigrant narrative. Like, we will be happy, you know, we're happy for people to live in this country so long as they contribute to society, so long as they're like worthy of their place here, almost. But I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what exactly you wanted to get out in terms of what you were talking about with regards to this narrative. What was important for you to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always struck me for a number of years that this migration that my family was a part of has been really politicized, and it was at the time in the 70s, and it continues to be to this day. You know, a number of politicians made statements around the anniversary last year praising Ugandan Asians for their business nous, for their contributions, and it's mostly economic contributions which people are talking about here. And again, yeah, I'm not criticizing that at all. It's brilliant if people can move to another country, get involved, make successes for themselves and for the people, build lives that they want. But this idea of praising one group of migrants, for me, it always feels like you're by the nature criticizing another. It's a comparison point, and it makes me feel very uncomfortable to be part of this group that are seen as good migrants when we live in a time where there is such horrendous discussion around other kinds of migrants. So I wanted to just make that point as much as anything, and for us to look at this idea that you have to be financially benefiting others to be deemed worthy as a migrant or just as a human being generally. And obviously, you know, we live in a capitalistic society, like that's really kind of at the root of everything. But I think just when we talk about this migration, and I mean, David Cameron has called it the most successful group of migrants, you know, these things have impact. And I think, yeah, that's what I wanted to show, that something that happened 50 years ago is really still present because it's part of these broader narratives that are woven around migration.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think for me, the biggest thing that it comes down to is that human beings shouldn't have to prove our worth to be granted safety or citizenship or a place to live. It should be just by virtue of the fact that we are human beings, and especially in the case of refugees or people that have been expelled or forcibly moved out, I think it is especially the case because that's also where the rhetoric is also the loudest and the most kind of far right and harmful. But actually we seem to lose this connection to just like the worth of human life, which is really sad.
Yeah, 100%. And it seems obvious to you and me, and I'm sure many other people, but yeah, not everybody does feel that way, unfortunately. And I think those of us that do need to talk about it.
Absolutely. So I'd like to know about your research process. So you mentioned obviously like it took you a few years to put the book together, and I mean I can tell that you've read a lot, you've also interviewed a lot of people, but what was that like?
Yeah, so my starting point was the personal with this. So I was chatting to family members. My grandmother also left me a wonderful resource, which is not hugely long, but a sort of diary, which was not written contemporaneously, but she sort of wrote a reflection on her life in her later years, which gave me a lot of really useful factual information as a starting point of dates, times, places. And then I was just reading a lot around the subject, generally looking at archives and some of the original source material. But I really wanted this book to be story led. You know, we don't want dry history books. We want something that captures people's imagination, and that's individual personal stories really. And so yeah, I sort of set about contacting people and reaching out to communities and starting conversations. The approach I took was that everybody really has something interesting to say, and I wasn't looking for specific stories. I wanted to have a breadth, so that was probably my only requirement. And as you mentioned earlier, you know, we can have this kind of singular narrative around sort of business types, and so I didn't want to, you know, only focus on that. As I mentioned, my grandparents were teachers, so I had sort of some teachers. I did want to represent the trader community, so one of the families we follow throughout the book sort of does have that experience. I also wanted to reflect the diversity of religions, so there's a huge range of people who went from all different parts of India to Uganda, so making sure that we kind of covered a little bit of all of that, so that the kind of representation was in my mind when I was looking for people to have in the book. But other than that, I was just following my nose in terms of sort of journalistically what interested me. And yeah, that's kind of where I went. And so, yeah, I was chatting to one of the women, Kausa, who's features in the book, and talking to her about her experiences. And then she just sort of casually mentions that she had a lion cub at one point. You know, your ear goes, what? And yeah, it was just initial conversations like that. And then little points where I would think, okay, that's something people will want to know about.
Absolutely. I when I first read that, I was like, what? A lion cub? Like that? So really, really fascinating. So obviously you went into doing these interviews and your research with a certain amount of knowledge, whether that was, you know, from the stories from your family, but also like historically you are a historian and a journalist. But in your process, did you uncover things that were particularly shocking that you didn't know, or were just a bit more alarming than you had been expecting?
Definitely, yeah. I've learned a lot through this process, and I think importance of speaking to people about their experiences can't be underestimated, because there's so much that I picked up from conversations that you just don't find in academic papers or in sort of government memos. But taking it kind of all together, it really builds that picture. I think the main thing that probably surprised me was, maybe not surprised, but I hadn't quite appreciated, was just that level of fear and sort of chaos at that point of the expulsion order. You know, it was not clear what was happening. Orders were changing from day to day, and sort of a real feeling of a threatening feeling on the streets and on the radio, which was counting down every day, you know, till you had to leave. And speaking to people who were there, even people that were British and so weren't facing the threat themselves, feeling that kind of, that atmosphere was really brought to life to me. And like, I hope to sort of pass that on a little bit in the writing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't heard previously about, you know, that countdown that comes on like the radio and stuff stuff. And to me, that felt so scary, even just reading it, just the idea that you are constantly reminded every single day, kind of like how many days you have to leave, and God knows what would happen if you stayed beyond the 90 days. I think that sort of fear was really brought out in some of the stories that you told, but also that the detail within which you talk about what you've uncovered and what happened. And I think also when we talk about singular narratives and we look at the expulsion, that was also a really difficult time in Uganda generally. I think, there is one narrative that's like Idi Amin was just this like absolutely bizarre dictator who had a dream, and then there's other narratives that he was rejected by a South Asian woman, and so he had all this hatred building in his heart, and he just decided that he wanted them all out. And obviously there were reasons, because he felt like the Ugandans were being suppressed. And in some ways that narrative seems quite heroic, because it seems like he's trying to protect a group in society that has been somewhat oppressed or held back or are struggling financially and otherwise. But actually the reality is quite different, because he is a dictator, and so many Ugandans, Black Ugandans, actually suffered under his dictatorship. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I mean, that's certainly the framing that he gave, that he was emancipating Uganda from the vestiges of colonialism. The British had left a decade earlier, but the South Asians were still there as a sort of remnant of empire, holding their people under control. And it's a powerful narrative, and, it feeds into something that, as we said, there is an element of truth to it. So, but yeah, of course, you have to look beyond that. And the expulsion wasn't that violent towards South Asians, fortunately. And obviously all of that kind of climate of fear, it's easy to forget that people at the time didn't know that, they didn't know it was going to work out to be a relatively bloodless expulsion. But for Black Ugandans, it was not like that at all. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed under the Amin regime, and the numbers just aren't known because so many people just went missing during that period. Bodies weren't found. So it's hard to say exactly, but some people put the figures at up to 1 million people who were killed during that time. And I think The Exiled was a book that was focusing very much on the South Asian side of things. So I wasn't looking at that in as much depth, but I absolutely needed to include it. I think you can't tell stories around Uganda without talking about people there as well. And yeah, it's horrendous. There were notorious prisons, where the floors would be flooded with water and an electric current run through it, where people were. Stories about people being bludgeoned to death instead of shot to save bullets. And yeah, this idea that there were so many bodies that they were throwing them into the waterways, into the Nile. Yeah, it's really grim stuff. And I think that's also something that we need to talk about when we talk about this period of time, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe it doesn't get the sort of the attention that it deserves, partly maybe because there is a lack of sort of like recorded history about it, because as you said, people were just disappearing, but I guess it shows exactly how harmful Idi Amin was. And we forget that sometimes in this narrative that he was a dictator, and dictators are never benevolent, because they wouldn't be dictators. Like it's just not possible that they would be benevolent. And maybe they have a self-interest in protecting a certain group of society. I believe that, but there's just never there's not any kindness there, right? So yeah,
and it was such a difficult period for Uganda. Beyond even that, there had been violence before him, there was violence after him, and I do feel like focusing only on the South Asian expulsion could potentially overlook this, and I was quite keen for us to bring it into the same conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So it feels bizarre to think about how a leader of a country can just make an announcement and give 80,000 people 90 days to leave the country. And these people are it's a specific group based on their race and their cultural identity. Why do you think, after all of your research and also just your reflections over the years, why do you think that was even allowed almost to take place?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, the expulsion in 90 days seemed implausible to everybody. And a lot of people at the time simply thought it was a joke, didn't take it seriously for days or even weeks until it became clear that this wasn't one of the bizarre statements of a leader and it was actually actionable. I think from my research, what I hadn't realized to the extent is that it did have a precedent. So I think when you see it coming out of nowhere, and Amin said he basically had a dream where God had told him to do this, it seems fantastical. But when you place it in a context that the previous leadership had already been speaking about removing the South Asian population, you realize that this has been a conversation that has been going on within Uganda for a number of years. And it's also influenced by British migration policy. So in the years preceding this, Britain had been really tightening up its borders. Previously, you, as a member of the Commonwealth, had a citizenship effectively that gave you the right to come to the UK. This was starting to be seen by politicians in the 60s as impending problem, as they realised that people from former colonies could come to Britain, and there was, of course, huge fears of people and people of colour is what they're talking about here, swamping Britain's shores. So, there was two pieces of legislation, Commonwealth Immigration Acts, and they were restricting your automatic rights to come to Britain. Now, this didn't go unnoticed by other countries who were saying, oh, hang on a minute, like, you left South Asians here in Uganda and we had the understanding that they would be able to be coming backwards and forwards from Britain, but you're effectively saying you're stopping that. So are you forcing us to kind of deal with it on our side? So I suppose that's the side of it that I really kind of got a better understanding of, which is that it's not a crazy thing that came out of nowhere. It's perhaps that action is and that timeline is, but the general discussion about whether South Asians who had come to Uganda under the British Empire should remain there had been going on for, years.
And also, there was in Kenya around a similar time, there was these policies of Africanization, which again was kind of aimed at protecting African interests within Kenya, which I'm sure would have inspired or demonstrated the need of having such policies as well. So I think you're right in that it isn't an isolated, like a random, someone had just on a whim decided to do this, which is sometimes the narrative that we're told when we're not exploring it more widely. But one of the things I also found really shocking, because I didn't know this had happened, and you do detail it in the book, that when it became apparent that this was actually going to happen, and Britain realised that there was potentially up to 80,000 people, or I think 30,000 or 50,000 people that may be coming to the UK because these people had British citizenship, they came on the drawing board and tried to decide where to put these people in terms of places that were not in the UK. And I think reading it like sent chills down my spine, because this has been something that the UK has historically been part of doing, and it has caused so many problems around the world, but they're still doing it today. This is kind of, the narrative around sending refugees to Rwanda. Like, this is the same thing. It's Britain saying, okay, we can't completely wash our hands, but we don't want to flood our shores or flood our land. I wondered just your own reflections on that as well.
So when Amin's expulsion order happened, Whitehall was in panic. And as you say, they started strategizing as to where people could go that wasn't the UK. So part of that involved literally reaching out to leaders across the world, sending cables to governments. And this was sort of Commonwealth countries, Canada, Australia, India, but also, everywhere else effectively. And saying, can you help us with what is a refugee crisis? And very much trying to make this seem like a global responsibility, not related to Britain personally as related to the imperial years. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that, something that was classified for decades and then later revealed when those archives were opened is that sort of later in 1972, people were discussing if this was to continue happening, we can't keep taking people in. So could we find another island effectively to entirely offshore people to a different location, which is obviously where this Rwanda comparison is so strong. And they were talking about places like the Falklands, the Solomon Islands, and tons of other small territories where they would want to more. The details aren't clear as to what life would be like there. Are we talking about a sort of camp situation or what? But I mean, it doesn't sound like people are going to have a lot of freedom. And I think, that's a kind of horrifying thought. And especially in light of the fact that, a conservative government 50 years ago was talking about sending predominantly brown people to another location. And we have a conservative government today who's talking about more or less the same thing. And it's a real shame that we're still having these conversations now. And that's kind of why I feel it's so important to talk about our recent history, because there are these direct comparisons. And I'm not saying the situations are exactly the same. Obviously, there's a huge amount of difference and nuance. But on that very basic fact, it's quite startling. And I think when I think about it from a personal point of view, my grandparents loved Britain. They cared about that culture. They went from India. They loved their life in Uganda. They were very much part of that. They were recruited directly by a British officer in South India to work in Uganda. And for them to hear that Britain didn't want them, that's quite jarring. And I wonder how much they actually ever knew of that themselves.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that has struck me a lot in thinking about the expulsion is that a lot of people that were living in Uganda from India and like pre-partition India especially had lost so much connection to India. Like Uganda was their home. They had been there for decades and for generations. And then to be put in a position where they had British citizenship, sometimes had then lost their legal right to live in India, but also have no ties to that country, and then were also told that they weren't welcome in the UK. Like, I can't imagine what that feels like and what that must have been like for so many people.
And there's there's that dislocation, which is that so many people would presume, you'll go back to India, like that's the obvious thing. But it wasn't obvious to very many people. They did not have those connections still. And Uganda had a lot of British culture in it. And I think people felt, not everybody, but a lot of people felt more aligned to that by the time 1972 came around. And I think, and then of course there were people who didn't have British citizenship, didn't have Ugandan citizenship, and then were stateless. And that's a whole other part of the story where people really had nowhere to go.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like so devastating, I think, on so many levels, and also like massively complex and multi-layered, but just so terrible. And one of the things that you write about in the book as well, and I wondered if you could speak about it, is how families were torn apart through this. And just, there is a family you kind of follow throughout the book where the children came to the UK first, and then they were later reunited with their parents, and it just didn't, they had just moved apart so much in terms of their life experiences and struggles that it then became difficult for them to be a cohesive family unit again, which is so, when we think about the reunion of families after something like this, you always think it's so beautiful and harmonious and, everyone is just so grateful. But there's a part in the book where you tell us that they didn't even recognize each other. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about how that was happening, how families were torn apart at this time.
Yeah, so a lot of families were split up by the expulsion, and sort of citizenship and passports becomes very central to these experiences. So Uganda had been a British protectorate, so the majority of people who had gone there had the right to some kind of British citizenship. There's lots of different kinds, but we can just call it citizenship for ease. But also some people would take up Ugandan nationality. And oftentimes some members of the families would split them. Sometimes this was to sort of hedge your bets, so you would have a mix of options available to you within a family unit, or it was that it would be advantageous for the male in the family who was involved in business to have that local citizenship. So take that family, for example, the father had Ugandan citizenship, which had effectively been rendered null and void through Amin's decision. And everyone else had British citizenship. So the rest of the family could come to Britain, but leave who they would describe as the head of their family then behind. And people had to make decisions. So this family in particular, they decided to send 3 of their children to the UK. And then the parents stayed together and went to India to settle some of their other family and then work out how to get the father into the UK. What this effectively meant was that young children were sent to another country without any support, entirely on their own, ending up in the resettlement camp system that Britain set up, 16 camps across the UK to house Ugandan Asians before finding them more permanent residence. And yeah, this idea of being young in a new country, feeling totally other and trying desperately to fit in. And then a number of years later, you meet your family, and because you've tried so hard to fit in to your new surroundings, you don't fit in with your family. And yeah, it's devastating to hear about, that meeting that everybody had put a lot of anticipation on, and realizing that actually you don't even really speak the same language anymore, let alone have any cultural connections, because you have gone in such different directions. And I think it's very easy when we talk about these migrations of large numbers of people to lose that idea of what each individual person to person experience is like. And I think this story is a really good example of that.
Yeah, it's just, oh gosh, I think it shows like how complex any sort of like migration or resettlement is. And it's not just, there's often this sort of narrative that's like you go to a new place and you build a new life. But there's so many different facets to that, so many different things that needs to be taken into consideration, because your life up until that point still exists, and everything that has happened to you and everything that you have been through forms who you are. It's very, very, very complex. And that particular story really struck a chord with me, because I was like, but they were also children, and they talk about how they were living in these camps, and although people kept on asking them, oh, is there anything that we can do? But fundamentally, they also didn't have that help, because everyone else has their own families and their own struggles and their own trying to figure things out, which I can't imagine. Also, the decision that the parents had to make at that time to send their young children to live in a completely different country by themselves and trust that the system would somehow protect them.
Yeah, there's a lot of quick decision making being made in these circumstances. And I think that was another thing that struck me, that people just kind of almost by a random decision ended up in other countries. They just sort of stuck their finger in the air and ended up somewhere. And for some people, that was literally which was the shortest queue out of a number of queues that they could join on the day when they were queuing at embassies. So, it's amazing to think of the directions people's lives can take.
Yeah. So not all Ugandan South Asians, not all of them that came to the UK lived in these camps. Some of them were able to, like your grandparents, for example, found accommodation through the church in Cambridge, but people had family connections and friends that they could rely on. In your experience and your research, what do you think were some of the striking differences between people that had somewhere they could go to themselves and those that had to rely on the system?
Yeah, so I think being able to know you were meeting anyone that you knew already when you arrive somewhere, it just gives you that sense of ease that you don't have otherwise. There was already quite a big South Asian population in, for example, Leicester and other places, Bradford, around that region, and also in London. There had been this migration from Kenya in the years before, and also from Uganda, a lot of people did see this coming. The sort of writing was on the wall, like the days were numbered for the life as they'd known it there. So oftentimes, father, brother, uncle would sort of head over first and start sort of scoping things out. So a lot of people had at least someone in their extended family they could rely on. What that meant is that you went straight into a house, but you might be going into someone else's house. So this accommodation might not be all that much better if you were living multiple families to houses. And, you know, one story I read said that people actually did 2 shifts in a house, you know, like people did a night shift and a day shift in terms of sleeping to fit the amount of people in. So there was a lot of enterprising things going on. But yeah, I think just having a bit of stability does ease anything. So, for example, with my grandparents, who were very fortunately kind of donated accommodation, almost in the way that some Ukrainians have been recently, it meant that they just saved that energy that you have to put towards safety, and were able to then start working sooner. So they got jobs in schools. They'd gone down the ladder significantly. You know, they were teaching at universities, or they were headmistress. Now they were, you know, basic primary school teachers, but they were still kind of hit the ground running, I think, a little bit quicker. The camp system was also designed to assist with all of that. The purpose was resettlement, essentially. So people would quite quickly be speaking to you about where you might want to live, what kind of work you could do. And obviously you were building community with other people within them. So I've heard mixed reports about camp life. Some people obviously found it very difficult. Other people didn't mind it so much. So yeah, it's an interesting thing. And also a lot of people, I don't think, even know that camps housing migrants has ever existed in the UK. That in itself is quite a novel thing. And it's not just Ugandan Asians. I mean, there's been the case for migrants from all kinds of places, all the way up till Vietnam.
Absolutely. And what are some of the more, I don't know, like some of the more shocking experiences that you've read about or you've spoken to people about, those that were living in the camps? And I think the reason why I want to explore this a little bit is because there is such a, like, some of the far right narratives are so harmful in that they believe that coming to the UK is easy, and it's just this, like, you know, well, there are better opportunities here, but nobody would choose to live in some of these circumstances and go through some of these things. And I just wondered if you could take a little bit of a time just to talk a little bit about what it was actually like for some people.
Yeah, no, certainly wasn't a picnic. So these camps were mostly in old RAF sites, and actually quite recently it's been proposed that we will again house migrants on RAF sites. So that's another echo from the past that I've been noticing. So these were essentially sort of old wooden billets. They weren't, you know, insulated or particularly prepared to house people in winter. And yeah, they were sort of drafty, shared accommodation. Oftentimes families were just divided from others in beds by like a sheet, if they even had that, a curtain, sort of bunk bed situations. And people were kind of queuing up to get food in canteens. And then there wasn't much else to do other than that. So the sort of minor complaints stem from just being fed horrible food, as is the case in institutions anywhere, with kind of revolts taking place where people kind of insisted that they would either take over the entire catering themselves of camps, or they had to be able to purchase hot plates to cook proper food, essentially, through to really quite awful things, which I couldn't go into in full detail in the book. But yeah, I've heard stories of abuse of minors, people taking advantage of vulnerable people, yeah, underage relationships, and that extended out after people left the camp system. So I think, as with anything, crises draw the best out of people. The, you know, wonderful stories of volunteers who really did their utmost, you know, where you've been at home knitting jumpers for cold people in camps, through to people who naturally see people in a vulnerable state and think how they can take advantage of them. And I think, yeah, one of the things that I've really found in exploring these histories is that people don't like to talk about the difficulties. This is part of this, the stories that we hear around this, which is, you know, we got expelled, things were difficult, And then we went on the up again. And it's human nature to focus on that up again. But that difficult times were really difficult for some people. And a lot of people still live with the trauma of it, that the trauma of the dislocation, the trauma of racism, the trauma of abuse. And I think it takes a while to get to that when you talk to people. So often I would have an initial conversation which would fit roughly into that kind of down up narrative. And then it would be the second or third conversations where I could actually get to the nub of it, and people would start to be able to feel a bit more open to be honest about the difficulties they've faced. But essentially it's because, in my opinion, it's embarrassing to talk about some of the indignities that you have faced, especially as a migrant. And once you've put that behind you, you don't necessarily want to dwell on it. And I was quite mindful of, not re-traumatizing people during these conversations, but also making sure that we do kind of appreciate the truth of this time.
Absolutely. And I think as well as the struggles that people have faced living in the camps and arriving and trying to resettle in the UK, although, as you said, and you've said in the book as well, that the South Asians that were being expelled were not subject to, like, it wasn't like a bloodshed, the violence wasn't there, but I think the fear and just the environment of knowing that you have to leave, and all the things that come with that, leaving people behind, leaving your things behind, leaving your wealth behind. Like, I've read stories where people have had to, in their gardens, they've buried money or buried jewelry because they don't want the wrong people to find it. And I guess maybe there was a hope that they would come back someday as well. But I can't imagine the trauma of going through that, especially because so many people had to go to various embassies repeatedly to try and figure out where they can go. Is there, can they go to the UK, or do they have to look somewhere else? What are the options? Can they go as a family? Like, all of these things are so sort of emotionally and psychologically draining. I can't imagine what that must have been like. And then if you were then somebody that managed to get out, and obviously, and you do talk about it in the book as well, but leaving wasn't easy because there was this growing resentment and there was this growing issue. So people were being stopped on the way to the airport, and they were only allowed to take certain things, so they were robbed of jewelry and money and all of these horrible things. That they got through all of that and then came to the UK, and firstly they knew that they were not being welcomed, and then some of them having to live in these horrible camps. It feels like trauma upon trauma and crises within crises, which I think is probably the case in regards to any crisis. It's not just the situation itself; it's everything around that.
Yeah, I mean, a forced migration of any variety. Yeah, it's just got all of these stages to it, and feeling like you're always struggling against something. And I think it's the way that certain parts of society talk about small boats migrants today as if they're doing something simple to take advantage of us. It does definitely frustrate me, because just think of every step of that journey. It's just horrendous.
Absolutely. I just want to talk a little bit about your own grandparents, and also your parents. What was it like for you growing up? Were you told stories of Uganda? What kind of image was portrayed of that time, and also just their lives before, for you?
So I'd always been quite a nosy child. I think my journalistic interest started quite early. So yeah, I used to ask my parents, both of them, about their lives quite a lot when I was younger. My father was British. My mother had been born in Uganda, and I was in Australia. So, England and Uganda were both equally interesting to me in different ways. And I kind of heard about the kind of typical things you hear about a life in Uganda, that sort of tropical barefoot upbringing in a kind of almost paradise of a country. And a lot of people do have really, really fond memories of growing up there. And just kind of those stories of being on safari, seeing animals, having unusual pets. Yeah, it seemed like an amazing childhood. And so, I did used to ask a lot of questions. My grandparents didn't talk about Uganda very much. I can now obviously understand why. And actually, I think my grandmother in those writings I spoke about mentioned, she literally sort of signs off the Uganda years with the Uganda business, good or bad, was over. And I think that kind of typifies that kind of moving on attitude that she certainly took, which was, you know, circumstance had closed that chapter of her life and she was looking forwards. But I did actually interview my grandparents for a school project about kind of identity and racism when I was in primary school. So I'd sort of started thinking about these things pretty early, and I was always interested in finding out about it and viewed it as something quite fun in my past. And then obviously learning more about it, you realise it's got all these difficult sides to it as well.
So you obviously like have this mixed background. You know, your mother's parents were from Uganda, but they're Indian Ugandan, and then your father is white British. But not only do you have different elements of your like history and heritage, you've also moved yourself. How do you think those experiences have kind of fed into who you are, and also what led you to become a journalist, and also kind of put those skills and those kind of attitudes into your work, into this book in particular?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so I was 12 when we moved from Australia to the UK, and I think that had a huge impact on my life. I think it is, and that wasn't even a traumatic migration like we've been talking about, but still the upheaval of leaving a life and starting anew and being that odd one out definitely had an impact on me. And I think whilst this is the first time I've really worked on a personal story, my work has always been really about other people. Migration and belonging has been a long-term theme for me and will continue to be in my work. And of course, that must be born out of this personal experience. And I think I haven't always felt like I am anchored to anywhere specific, which I think when I was younger used to make me feel a little bit sad sometimes. But when I think about it now, it's an advantage, and I think it allows me to relate to a lot of people in very different circumstances. There's a strength that comes from that for sure.
Absolutely. Oh, that just like listening to you talk about that is really beautiful, and I think a lot of people from a whole host of backgrounds and life experiences will relate to that. I know I certainly do. When it comes to the book, what do you really hope that it will achieve? What do you hope that people that read it will take away from it?
I think I wrote this book to give some new angles to a history that I think has been overlooked, or when it has been explored, sort of looked at maybe a little bit too simplistically. Yeah, there's been this increasing interest in this. We've had some great fiction books. Kalola Hill, We're All Birds of Uganda. I'm looking forward to reading A History of Burning, which I haven't read yet. And I think it's great to have those fictional accounts, but I just wanted to sort of add this non-fiction piece to it. And so I guess what I hope is people who might not necessarily pick up a historical book as their first choice would be drawn into these kind of stories, and through that just learn a little bit more about the impact of empire then and now, and how things that happened 50 years ago really continue to play a role today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lucy, thank you so much for your time today. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you.
Yeah, wonderful to speak to you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much to Lucy for her time today. This was such an insightful and interesting conversation, and I really hope that people take a lot away from it. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.